This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. So welcome everybody. Today, of course, is Yom HaShoah, which has been designated by the state of Israel as Holocaust Remembrance Day. And the Holocaust is something that is, as we will see, we're going to go through many sources. Excuse me, I don't know if we'll go through all of them, but if any of you want, I forgot to email it prior to the class. I apologize. If any of you would like me to email to you the source sheet, let me know, and I will gladly do it as soon as the class is over. And what I like to do with this class is present just a whole sweep of perspectives, some from people who survived and suffered through the Holocaust, others from scholars afterwards, and to just try to give us somewhat of a framework and somewhat of an approach. Even though, as we'll see in the sources, and as I titled it, Fathom the Unfathomable, right? The true understanding is something that I don't think in this world any of us will be able to really digest and really come to terms with when we read about and learn about just the horror, the absolute degradation, and the inhumanity. It's overwhelming, and it's almost unbelievable. And I recently met with one of the shul members who was struggling with this, and I recommended, there's an incredible book called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust by Professor Eliach. Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. And it helps to put the neshama into it. That instead of just reading statistics and horror and statistics, it helps to put the neshama into it. And that's a book that I personally, every Tisha B'Av, I huddle down with that. And for me personally, I find it's difficult. It's painful. It's painful. It doesn't sugarcoat anything. On the contrary, but it gives it a neshama. It gives it some soul, and that I think is crucially important. Okay, without further ado, we're just going to go through sources, and feel free to unmute yourselves and speak up at any point if you'd like to. Okay. This is from the Slonim Rebbe, the Nesiva Shalom, the first quote from Avshalom Noach Berezovsky, right, who was, again, the Rebbe of Slonim, right, who's written a classic called the Nesivas Shalom that many people study. And actually, this Shabbos, during my drasha Shabbos morning, I will be sharing a beautiful Torah teaching from the Nesivas Shalom. My late brother Josh Alav Shalom was a tremendous fan of the Nesiva Shalom, so I like to bring his teachings in when I can. Rav Shalom Noach Berezovsky, the Slonim Rebbe, reflecting on the terrible fate of the nation, could offer nothing but silent mourning. Each one of us weeps inwardly, and we are gathered here to give expression to this pain and to give voice through the joining of hearts to the terrible common sorrow. Yet concerning that it is written, the wise will be silent at that time. For the tears have not yet been created, nor the expression come into being that will be appropriate to the great catastrophe, the horror of the tragedy that is the slaughter of the greater part of the nation. The best of the people's forces, the extraordinary Torah scholars, tzaddikim of Israel, yeshivot students. In such a situation, the only appropriate response is that of Eov's friends. They sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said a word for the pain was great. And in Yechezkel, Ezekiel, when God tells the Navi, the prophet, behold, I shall take the delight of your eyes, and that they should not mourn. Rashi explains because there are no comforters, since everyone is mourning. All of this has come to pass for us. We should not mourn because there is no mourning that is appropriate and fitting for such a terrible destruction. And this is something that appears in our parsha this week. This week we read the parsha of Shmini, and we read about the great joy, the ecstasy that was reached with the consecration of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. This is almost a year after they had left Egypt, and it was completed, and the divine presence came down, and a fire came down from heaven. And then, right then, the two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, they brought a non-commissioned offering flame into the Holy of Holies, and they died right then and there. And Aaron's response is, Vayidom Aaron. Aaron was silent. Because there are times that there are no words that can be said. And actually, when we go to visit a mourner, the mitzvah is to go and be silent. Let the mourner guide the discussion in the direction that they want to have, or no discussion if that is what they choose. Because there are times that there are no words that can properly be used, and therefore it's best to be silent. The Klosenberger Rebbe source, let me bring it up, sorry, which is number 1. I know the numbering system is a little bit wonky, I apologize. The Klosenberger Rebbe went through the Holocaust, went through the camps. He writes, I can testify from my own experience when he reached the extermination camps, right? And that's a more accurate term than a concentration camp. A concentration camp is almost a sanitized term. It was an extermination camp. When I took a group of us from Beth Jacob on a Poland-Israel trip about 3 years ago now it was. And maybe we should consider scheduling another one if there are those who want to go. They were extermination camps. We visited Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majanov. When we reached the extermination camps, we stood there naked and with nothing, without clothing, without coverings for our heads, and with the wicked ones beating incessantly with the batons in their hands. The situation was terrible. I turned to those standing around me and I shouted, fellow Jews, know that the Holy God is waiting for us there, inside the camp. And let us not forget that God is with us. If that is not incredible faith, heroic faith. Throughout that entire year, I worked on this. The Rebbe, the closing of a Rebbe is saying that he needed to work on it. Strengthening myself and not forgetting that God was with us and that the entire world is filled with his glory, even in Auschwitz and Dachau, and that no place is devoid of him. We say, Malei kol haaretz kavodo. God's glory fills the entire earth. We'll see different sources, how our actions can sometimes cause God to recede, to step back. And God's presence, God's involvement is the source of all blessing and all good. And when God steps back, as we are seeing now, as we know, all hell can and hell on earth did break loose. Number 2, in this connection, it is said of Rav Avraham Yishaya Karelitz, known as the Chazon Ish, he used to stand up in respect for Holocaust survivors. Likewise, when the Satmar Rebbe was preparing to move from Israel to America, he was asked, Rebbe, to whom we go for blessings? He replied, go to any shul where you see someone wrapping tefillin over the numbers he got in the concentration camps. He has the power to bless. Those whose faith survived are truly heroes of the Holocaust. And when we were still graced with their presence, saying they're no longer with us, on a Friday night, I used to try to get a bracha when I was at a meal together. When I was at a meal together with an Irving Gelman. Yeah, I used to get a bracha. Or with a Nissenbaum. I used to try to get a bracha from such people. When people ask, how could it be? How could such a thing happen? It's in the Torah. As uncomfortable as that is for us, it is in the Torah. Source number 3, the Torah describes situations of national disaster in sections known as the Tochacha, the rebuke. There are 2 of those. There's 2 Tochachot. At the end of Vayikra Leviticus, in the Parsha of the Chukotai, and towards the end of Devarim, Deuteronomy, in Kitavo. Both sections begin with a glorious description of a redeemed world in which the Jewish people fulfills all of its obligations to God. We will enjoy health and wealth, spiritually uplifted. Land is fruitful and blessed. That vision, though, is then supplanted by one of a world in which we have turned our backs on God. God's wrath, we are warned, will express itself in horrific national suffering. You read that, you see the description. A Holocaust survivor once said that when they read these sections of rebuke during the Holocaust, different survivors would nod to each other in recognition that they were experiencing each of the afflictions foretold. When we approach the subject of the Holocaust, we must remember that such national tragedies have long been part of our history and is clearly predicted in the Torah. Rav Shlomo Wolbe, who was a tzaddik that I had the privilege of meeting quite a number of times and going to speak to him about different things. He was known as a mashkiach's mashkiach. Mashkiach means supervisor. We're not talking about someone who supervises the kashrut of an institution like we normally use the term mashkiach today. But in the yeshiva world, the mashkiach is a supervisor, meaning he's a spiritual supervisor. And he's there to work with the boys to help them grow spiritually. And he was the mashkiach of the yeshiva that I studied at in Israel, and was known as mashkiach of the mashkiachs of so many, the spiritual guide of the spiritual guiders. He writes, frightening, source number 4, in the year 1844, a meeting of Reformed Jews in the city of Brunswick, Germany, threw off the burden of the mitzvot. That was the conclusion that they reached. And they permitted intermarriage. They said, by Jewish law, there's nothing wrong with intermarriage. When Rabbi Yisroel Salanter heard of this, he said they made their own new Shulchan Aruch code of Jewish law, in which they permitted intermarriage. The time will come, and the Goyim, the nations, will make their Shulchan Aruch, and they will forbid marriages with Jews. Oy vavai to us Jews from their Shulchan Aruch. If we're going to make, he predicted, if we are going to make our own Shulchan Aruch, our own code of Jewish law, forsaking the Torahs, then the nations will respond with their Shulchan Aruch. 90 years later, once again in Germany, in 1934, this time in Nuremberg, Hitler Yamach Shemo's legislation forbade intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, with a death sentence as penalty. That became German law. And Rav Chaim of Volozhin, who was the prime disciple of the Vilna Gaon, famously and pithily said, if the Jews don't make Kiddush, then the nations make Havdalah. Of course, a play on words, Kiddush at the start of Shabbos, Havdalah at the end of Shabbos. Kiddush ushering in Shabbat, Havdalah escorting out Shabbat. But what he's saying is if the Jews do not sanctify themselves and recognize that we need to live in an exalted, uplifted fashion, and we try to become just like everyone else, then the nations make Havdalah. Havdalah, of course, means separation. And when the Jews decided intermarriage was allowed, 90 years later, the nations decided intermarriage was not allowed. Rav Dessler, in source number 5, writes about the world events leading up to this period of time of World War I and World War II, the opportunity that it afforded and how it was commandeered, how that opportunity was in the end distorted. He writes, we are struck dumb at the terrible destruction that has been visited upon us in our generation, and we ask ourselves, for what reason has God done this to us? What is this great wrath? Let us examine this. The entire period that preceded the destruction was a time when the burden of the exile was lightened upon the shoulders of the Jewish people. Clearly, the period of the emancipation was ordained by God to serve as a preparation for us for the coming of the Messiah. And it was for this purpose that the burden of exile was lightened upon us. The burden of the exile was lightened to a tremendous degree by this whole wave of the emancipation. And we have turned the purpose upside down. And instead of understanding the hint from above to prepare ourselves for redemption out of joy and expanding our consciousness, we use the new situation to assimilate, to lose our identity instead of strengthening our identity. Therefore, there awaited us the well-known danger of preparation for holiness that is not realized. And the fact that the destruction came only now, even though the process of assimilation was one that had developed gradually for a long time, is because, as we say in the 13 attributes, God is erech apayim, long-suffering, patient, hoping for a turnaround, and does not bring punishment until the measure of sin is full. And there is no hope any longer of a positive influence bringing about a repair. Yeah, and Rav Yitzchak Kersner in source number 6 follows a very, very similar idea. The second paragraph there. The truth is that the situation in Germany was only the most extreme example of a problem that had crept into Jewish life everywhere. A survivor from Warsaw once told me that the decline in religious observance between the two world wars was so precipitous that we seemed destined for a national tragedy. God's response was to show the world, and the Jewish people in particular, that the culture viewed as the epitome of sophisticated humanism could turn into a ravenous beast. And we'll see quotes later on. I'm sorry, I didn't move your page up. I apologize. We'll see quotes later on that the approach of some, when asked, actually, Professor Eliach, Yafa Eliach, the author of the book I mentioned before, Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust, writes in her introduction, She was part of the Carter Commission on the Holocaust studies, and she traveled to Europe with a whole group from the United States. And when they were in the Ramaz shul, synagogue there, which is a shul that we visited on our Poland-Israel trip, so she was asked if she wanted to speak, to call God to judgment over what had happened. And her response, as she writes so beautifully there, was, I did not want to call God to judgment. I wanted to call mankind to judgment. How can mankind become such horrific, methodical beasts? And incredibly, it was Germany, which was the epitome of culture, opera, classical music, ballet. It was the epitome of culture, like he writes, that turned into a ravenous beast. Number 7 is very important. The observant did not focus only on the sins of those multitudes leaving the Torah. As the entire Jewish tradition teaches, we must always begin with examining ourselves and not point a finger outwards. Even if the most obvious sins were those of the Torah abandoners, we are an entity whose actions are bound together on many levels. Rabbi Yisroel Salanter again is quoted saying, if a student, a yeshiva bacher, lifts his head from his Gemara in Vilna, a Jew intermarries in Paris. We are all connected. We are all responsible for one another. Source 8 and source 9 are points that I mentioned before about silence. Sorry, I'll move this up for you. Silence in the context of mourning. And the Gemara Brachot is the Gemara that I quoted before that said, Agra de Beit Tamya, Agra, the reward of Beit Tamya visiting a house of mourning, Shtikuta, quiet. Don't come in there and start yapping away. Quiet. Because by being quiet, one is giving the message to the mourner that to the best of our ability, we recognize that there is no answer. And there are no words that we can offer to fill the void that's now become your life. And as I mentioned before, that Aaron was silent with the death of his 2 sons. That we'll read about in this week's Parsha. Let's take a look at number 10 of Aaron Lupiansky. Aaron's silence in response to the death of his sons was very different than the silence the rabbis praise when they speak of the greatness of one who keeps quiet during an argument. Another time to be quiet is during an argument, because it doesn't go anywhere. It just adds fuel to the fire. The latter is one who restrains himself despite having the words to respond. In an argument, you might have the response, but you stay quiet. Aaron's silence was an acknowledgement that some things come from a realm far beyond a man's ability to grasp in words. Like Abraham at the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, Aaron had entered a space which the intellect cannot reach. At the end of the book of Job, God quiets Eob's friends in their arguments for divine justice and brings Eob to the true answer. In God's world, there are things beyond man's grasp. And that's how I personally deal with many things that come our way. And the way that I like to express it is If we are believing in a creator, in a God who created this incredible universe on the macro scale, incredible, down to the micro scale, the DNA and the AGA and all that that's made up of. If we're talking about a creator like that, and we recognize that in our world, in our places, there are certain things that we cannot explain to a 3-year-old, to a 4-year-old, to a 5-year-old, to an 8-year-old. And we recognize that the difference in cognitive ability between an 8-year-old and ourselves is nothing compared to the difference between our understanding and the understanding of a creator that made this incredible, incredible world that we just keep finding out more and more and more about. Physicists have now just come up with a new particle called a muon, I think, related to the bison. I mean, it's right, which is not working according to the great principles of physics that seem to explain how everything should work. Which means there's so much more than we can fathom. So certainly the difference between the understanding of an 8-year-old and ourselves is nothing compared to the difference between our understanding and that of the creator of this world that we visit. And therefore silence, humility, the recognition that there are things that are beyond our comprehension. Yeah. And that's source number 11 is talking about this inability to understand. And let me bring it up, sorry again. We debated, I'm starting in the middle of there, second line. We debated this question more than once in Belzen. Jews attempted to delve deeply into the truth and grasp the course of events. All debates ended with the same conclusion, an ancient conclusion. God's ways in running the world are inestimably beyond anything a mortal can understand. But we as believing Jews need to understand, accept that we don't understand. As Rav Yaakov Naiman writes in Darchei Musar, Lahamin, to believe that God created heavens and earth does not require great wisdom. One's basic intellect, when we recognize the awesomeness of this universe, and to think that it's all random, to me is a ridiculous conclusion to reach. As he writes, one's basic intellect directs one to have such a belief. However, the highest level of faith is to believe in God when one sees things that defy one's intelligence and cause one to ask difficult questions on the ways of God. When one nevertheless dismisses these questions and has faith in the God of the Jewish people and understands that it is impossible to comprehend the Creator, this is the highest level of belief. And let me just interject. We are meant to try to learn and to try to emulate. And our sages teach us, as God is compassion, be compassionate. The Torah begins with God clothing the naked, clothe the naked. The Torah ends with God burying the dead, as in Moses, bury the dead. We need to go in all the ways that we can, that we understand. But when we don't understand, that's when we need to have that humility. To believe that there is Ein Avel, as we say in the Parsha of Azinu, there is no injustice, even though our eyes' perception leads us to what appears to be staggering injustice. as we've seen in our recent history with the murder of 6 million Jews. Regarding this, one must believe there is no injustice, for everything that the merciful one does is for the good. There's a heavenly calculation for everything. Rabbi Twersky is the one who said, we cover our eyes when we say, Shema Yisroel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Because sometimes we need to cover our eyes in order to make that proclamation. We need to shut out the things that we see that are so confusing and that are so misleading. The example I like to give, a person comes rushing in. I saw the most horrific thing. There was a person strapped down on a table. And another person stood over him with a knife and started to cut him open and pull out parts of the body. Barbaric, horrific. Or a surgery, or a life-saving surgery. It all depends on the perspective that a person has. It all depends on the understanding that one has of those different acts. And when it comes to the world, most of the time we are lacking that perspective and that understanding. Source number 13, I'm sorry. Please remind me when I'm not scrolling. Okay. Source number 13 gives a very important concept. You know, we have different categories of mitzvot. We have the mishpatim. Those are called the judgments that with our own judgment, we might have reached the same conclusion. Don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Those would go in the category of mishpatim. There is edut, testimony. We all ate matzah not that long ago as testimony of our belief in the events that took place during the Exodus. And then there are chukim, mitzvot that we do not know the reason behind them. Go to the second paragraph in 13. God could have created us with the intellectual capacity to understand every mitzvah, including the chukim. Chukim are not mitzvot without a reason. Chukim are mitzvot to which the reason of we are not privy to. Or, so he could have given us understanding in all the mitzvot. Or he could have left out the chukim. He could have limited the Torah to only those mitzvot that we are capable of comprehending. But he didn't either. He gave us the chukim to introduce the element of trust into our relationship with him. We do not understand them. We observe them because we trust him. In a relationship, there needs to be trust. Husband and wife. It's not, well, why should I do that? If they ask you to do it, we step up and do it. That's what a relationship, a loving, trusting relationship is. And the Meshech Chochmah in number 14, go towards the fourth line from the bottom. Can you see my cursor when I move it? Yeah. Rabbi Meir Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk, known as the Meshech Chochmah, writes that there is a vast difference between suffering, pain, and death that results in complete annihilation and destruction, and annihilation and destruction that leaves behind something to survive and grow. That latter type of destruction is designed to produce a remnant that has been purified and strengthened. God never promised that he would not bring any destruction on the Jews. On the contrary, we read the Tochacha. What he promised is he will never wipe us out entirely. Whatever destruction we suffer is not to obliterate, but to burn away a decaying shell and reveal a healthy inner body. And a story that I've said many times, and many of you have heard it from me many times already. But to me, it is just overwhelming. And as Buchenwald, one of the concentration extermination camps, was being liberated, there was an 8-year-old boy there who was the youngest survivor of Buchenwald. He had been on his running for his life for the past 5 years. No education, no Jewish education, no any education. Education in how to stay alive. And how to stay alive. When he encountered Rabbi Schachter, who was a Jewish chaplain, and Rabbi Schachter asked this young boy, "How old are you?" His response was, "I'm older than you." And the chaplain, Rabbi Schachter, asked him, "Why do you say that?" And he said, "Look at you, you're crying like a baby. I haven't shed a tear in years." If someone would have pointed to this boy and whispered to the person next to him, that boy is going to become the chief rabbi of the state of Israel that will be established in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, the name of which was changed to Palestine to remove the Jewish name of it. If someone would have said that to his friend, the friend would have thought, "Aye, tragic. My buddy over here, his body survived, but his mind has gone. He's become a lunatic. Chief rabbi, state of Israel, in the ancient Jewish homeland, are you crazy? Look around. Destruction, 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 death, death, depravity, depravity." But we know, in fact, that that 8-year-old boy, Luca, Yisroel Meir Lau, became the chief rabbi of the state of Israel, established in our ancient Jewish homeland. And that, the Meshech Chochmah says, is the difference between these two types of destructions. An important lesson for us going forward is source number 15 of divisiveness, senseless hatred. Second paragraph, the divisiveness includes also the sword that prevails between one rabbi and another, even when their intention is to bring glory to God. Lo titgodedu, do not become separate groups. That's what we need to work on, my friends. I ran to do some errands this morning to pick up some groceries for Natalie. And as I was checking out a Wholesome Choice, there were two seemingly non-observant Israelis in front of me talking in Hebrew. They're buying some food. So I said to them, B'tei avon, bon appetit, enjoy. So they turned to me, started talking, and one of them pointed to his friend, who didn't seem to be very observant, and he said to him, Ha'aba shalo Rav Gadol. He said to me, Ha'aba shalo Rav Gadol. His father is a great rabbi. And I said, Va'ben shalo Tzaddik Gadol. And his son is a very righteous person. We all had a nice, warm encounter. You can't judge others by their outside. Can't judge them by their inside. We can't judge others. We need to just recognize we're all one family and treat each other in such a way. Source number 16, worth reading. 17 is the pasuk that I alluded to before, the verse in Devarim, Deuteronomy. Anochi hastir astir panai michen. I will hide my face away from you. And number 18, quoting Rabbi Sachs, Zechrono Livracha, God has given man freedom. When the people of Israel is faithful to the divine word, it lives securely in this land and experiences the providence of God. At such times, one can speak of divine, carefully, divinely orchestrated reward and punishment. But when it abandons God, it is sent into exile, which is not punishment as such, but something worse, the withdrawal of providence. God hides his face, that verse above in 17. The moral distinction between these two states of affairs was spelled out by the medieval Jewish philosophers. When God punishes, it is very, very finely calibrated. He punishes only the guilty. But when he withdraws his providence, he leaves man to chance, in Maimonides' phrase. At such times, even when the innocent may suffer, even the innocent, may suffer. For tragedy is then the result not of divine, but of human action. Like I mentioned before, Professor Yafa Eliach of blessed memory, her claim was not where was God, but where was mankind? Where was man? Number 19. Eliezer Berkowitz chose this line of approach to the Holocaust. Seen in the religious context of freedom and responsibility, it tells us not about God, but about man. For Berkowitz, Auschwitz represented the moral disintegration of Western civilization. It was the culmination of centuries of theologically inspired hatred of Jews as the bearers of God's word. It disclosed what had always been present as a possibility, that man might choose ultimate evil. I try to say a couple of chapters of Tehillim each day, and happened to be this morning's chapter was 69, and verse 9 in Tehillim 69 says, Muzar hayiti le'achai, I became like a stranger to my brothers, referring to the descendants of Yishmael, Isaac's brother. The Nachri, and I was an alien, a foreigner, livnei imi, to the sons of my mother. That's Esav's descendants. Kikinas beitcha achalani, because the jealousy of your house has fallen upon me. Achalatni, has consumed me. V'cherpot chorfecha naflu alai. And their hatred, and the hatred of those who desecrate you, who are against you, God, naflu alai, fall upon me. They direct that to us. Number 20, Rav Yitzchak Kerzner is quoting Rav Elchanan Wasserman. Rav Elchanan Wasserman was the Rosh Yeshiva of an illustrious yeshiva in Europe, the Baranovich Yeshiva. He was the main disciple of the sainted Chafetz Chaim. He was in the United States raising money for those in need during the start of the war, when people begged him to remain in the safety of the United States, and he refused, saying, I will not desert my flock, my children meaning my students, and also his family. And he was murdered. He was murdered before he was taken out to be murdered. He spoke to those assembled, and he addressed God directly. To the people, he gave a beautiful mashal, a beautiful parable of a city person who went out to the field, went out to the country. I had a neighbor who was a farmer and watched the farmer plant this beautiful field. Wow. Well, I'm sorry. First, he watched the farmer. There's a beautiful grass field. He watched the farmer plow it up. He said, why is he destroying? Then he saw him throwing good seeds into the ground, and he said, what a waste. And then beautiful wheat grew, and he said, oh, now I understand. And then the farmer came and chopped down that wheat, and he said, he's crazy. And then he took that wheat and he ground it up into flour. He said, he's destroying such beautiful wheat. Then he adds water and turns it into this big gooey mess. And he says, my neighbor's insane. It's not safe to remain here. And then the farmer fashioned those into beautiful loaves of bread. And he said, oh, now I see what he's doing. And then he saw him putting those loaves of bread into a fire, into an oven that was 500 degrees. And he said, this man's a maniac. And he left. And he never saw the beautiful loaves that came out of the oven. That was the parable Rav Chanan shared with those who were with him as they were about to be killed, when they asked for some words before they would meet their maker, before they would leave this world, that we don't understand. We see different stages. We think we understand, and we don't understand. But then in source 20, he turned to God and said, with fire you send destruction in our midst, and with fire you will rebuild the Jewish people. His last words to his students were, the fire is about to engulf our bodies. That very fire will return and build the house of Israel. And once again, we return to Rabbi Sachs in source number 21. Even if a backward-looking explanation in terms of sin and punishment failed to do justice to the tragedy, there is another traditional approach to look forward and attempt to understand the Holocaust not in terms of divine punishment, but divine purpose. It was not the end of the Jewish people. 3 years later, a no less epic event took place. The creation of the state of Israel. Emerging from the shadow of death, Jews returned to the promised land. And was this not precisely what the Torah had foretold? Again, back to the Tochacha at the end of Leviticus and towards the end of Deuteronomy. When all the blessings and cursings I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart, wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and take you back in love. He will bring you together again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. The covenant has not been broken. It has rather been reconfirmed. And I always say, my friends, we are living the dream. For thousands of years, Jews turned toward Jerusalem every time they prayed. And they finished a meal and they said, B'shuv Hashem Ashir Amalot, B'shuv Hashem Shiva Tzim Ugal, bring back the remnants of Israel. Hayinu Kachoma will be like dreamers. And we're living the dream. Go on to the different sites now. You'll see you can get a round trip ticket to Israel for $700, $500. And we take it for granted. We are living the dream. We are living the fulfillment of all of these prophecies. We are living the reconfirmed covenant that had been stretched perhaps to the limit. I'll go to number 23, with which we'll conclude. And once again, anybody wants me to send, I'll send to those who I normally send to those who ask for it. Anybody else would like me to send you the notes, I'm happy to do so. Just shoot me an email, rabbic@bethjacobirvine.org, rabbic@bethjacobirvine.org. Send me an email and I will reply as quickly as I can with that, with the notes that I've been sharing over here. Number 23. In his writings and discussions on this subject, the Lubavitcher Rebbe rejected all theological explanations for the Holocaust. What greater conceit and what greater heartlessness can there be than to give a reason for the death and torture of millions of innocent men, women, and children? Can we presume to assume that an explanation small enough to fit inside the finite bounds of human reason can explain a horror of such magnitude? We can only concede that there are things that lie beyond the finite ken of the human mind. Echoing his father-in-law, he would say, it is not my task to justify God on this. Only God himself can answer for what he allowed to happen. And the only answer we will accept is the immediate and complete redemption that will forever banish evil from the face of the earth and bring to light the intrinsic goodness and perfection of God's creation. To those who argued that the Holocaust disproves the existence of God or his providence over our lives, Lubavitcher Rebbe said, on the contrary, the Holocaust has decisively disproven any possible faith in a human-based morality. In pre-war Europe, it was the German people who epitomized culture, scientific advance, philosophic morality. And these very same people perpetrated the most vile atrocities known to human history. And don't think that it was the riffraff of society that did it. It was the doctors. You go to Yad Vashem and you see the main architects of this genocide was doctor this and doctor that, be they doctors of medicine or doctors of philosophy. The university professors were all in. If nothing else, the Holocaust has taught us that a moral and civilized existence is possible only through the belief in and the acceptance of the divine authority. He also said, our outrage, our incessant challenge to God of what has occurred, this itself is a most powerful attestation to our belief in him and our faith in his goodness. Because if we did not, underneath it all, possess this faith, what are we outraged about? The blind workings of fate? The random arrangement of quarks that make up the universe? It is only because we believe in God, because we are convinced that there is right and there is wrong, and that right must ultimately will triumph, that we cry out as Moses did, Lama hareyota la'am hazeh. Why, my God, have you done evil to your people? For the most important thing that we'll conclude today, my friends, besides any comments or questions that anybody wants to bring up about the Holocaust, is not how we do or do not understand it, nor even how we memorialize its victims, but what we do about it. Not why, as Rabbi Sachs often would say, not why, but what. If we allow the pain and despair to dishearten us from raising a new generation of Jews with a strong commitment to their Jewishness, then Hitler's final solution will be realized, God forbid. But if we rebuild, if we raise a generation proud of and committed to their Jewishness, we will have triumphed. The question we need to ask is not why, because we're not going to fathom it. Not why, but what. What is it that we need to do now going forward? And fascinatingly, as we discussed in different classes, the Hebrew word for what, lama, is actually lema, to what? Where will this lead to? And that's what we need to ask. Any question of lama is not why, but lema. What can we do? Whether it is strengthening our Judaism, strengthening those of the dreams of those around us, whether it is the unity that we show to one another, whether it is the Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name that we show to the greater world by the way that we talk and we act and we behave, That is the lema, the to what that we need to focus on as individuals, as a community, and as a nation. Okay, my friends, we will call it over here. Anybody wants to comment, ask, you're more than welcome to. I prefer having meeting in person. Hopefully pretty soon we'll be able to, which allows for a much more organic discussion and study. In this Zoom world, it's a little more challenging. Yes, please.
Rabbi, the radio commentator who's based in San Francisco put it this way, John Rothman, he says, we cannot let Hitler get a posthumous victory.
Yeah, well said. Well said, Janet. Or is that Roger with a high voice? I'm not sure.
I'd like to mention the education system right now, and I'm not sure if people know about the Amcha initiative. That is a watchdog on college campuses across the country, and the anti-Semitism legislation that's getting pushed is, with all these professors and doctors, the same thing that you were just talking about in Germany.
Yeah. I once heard Dennis Prager speak. It was at a Kufi conference, Christians United for Israel. Pastor Hagee, who gives a mussar shmooze like most rabbis would be afraid to give, and Dennis Prager spoke, and he pointed out something very fascinating there. He said it used to be in the past, Christianity was our worst enemy. Crusades, pogroms, riled up by their priests, and our sanctuary was the universities, that whole world. He said, and now it's been flipped over, and Christianity has become friends of the Jewish people and stands up for the Jewish people and stands up for Israel. And the universities have become the breeding ground of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. And I just read a beautiful quote this morning. Yeah. Lest one confuse and say, well, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. So a very simple question needs to be asked. If you have this unbridled hatred and animosity against only one country in the entire world, and that one country happens to be the Jewish country, then maybe there might be a link between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Something to food for thought for those who want to distinguish between the two. No, we're for human rights, but no other country in the world are they pouncing upon except the one Jewish country. Yeah.
Can I just mention one other thing?
Sure.
About Dennis Prager. He's got this movie and it's free on Netflix. It's called No Safe Spaces. It's all about what the university is doing. If you're not frightened now when you watch that, you just won't believe it.
He has a lot of great stuff on his Prager University that is very worthwhile to see. A friend of mine is writing a book about his father, who's a survivor of the Holocaust, an incredible person. And he asked me to write the afterword. And one of the things that I wrote is, he wrote there in the book about in his Polish city where his father and grandfather lived. So there'd be signs that said, Jews, get out of Poland. Jews, go to Palestine. And I wrote that I can't help but contrasting what you see now, which is Jews, get out of Palestine. Jews, go back to Poland. Which makes you realize that according to some people in the world, there is no place in this world for Jews. And we need to stand proud, stand strong, live exemplary lives so as not to give ammunition to those who try to put us down, but not back down. Am Yisroel Chai. Am Yisroel Chai, the Jewish people we live on. And out from that Buchenwald came the chief rabbi of the state of Israel. We're living the dream, and we can't take it for granted, and we have to appreciate it, and we have to make sure that we're doing what we can as individuals, as a community, and as a nation to earn and to deserve that. Okay, my friends, good seeing everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well. David, good
Thank
seeing
you.
you. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Bye-bye.